20 hours, November 11th, 1940, the Ionian Sea. The deck of HMS Illustrious is a place of organized chaos, a pitching, swaying steel island plunging through the darkness 170 miles southeast of the Italian coast. The air is frigid, thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, hot oil, and the sharp tang of the Mediterranean salt spray that lashes over the bow. On the flight deck, illuminated by the dim red glow of working lights, men move like ghosts around machines that belong to another, older war. They are fairy Swordfish biplanes, nicknamed Stringbags by the men who flew them. They are an anachronism, a tangle of wires, struts, and fabric-covered wings that look utterly inadequate for the task ahead. With a fixed undercarriage and an open cockpit, they look more suited to the skies of 1918 than the mechanized inferno of 1940. Yet, in the next 3 hours, these machines are tasked with rewriting the entire doctrine of naval warfare. They are the scalpel for a procedure of unprecedented audacity, an operation that many in the Admiralty back home considered pure, unadulterated suicide. In the Admiral's quarters, Sir Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, faced the grim arithmetic of his situation. His fleet was outnumbered and outgunned by the Italian Regia Marina. The cornerstone of Italian power, their fleet in being, lay protected in the great harbour of Taranto. 6 battleships, including 2 of the brand-new, formidable Littorio-class dreadnoughts, sat behind a screen of cruisers, destroyers, anti-aircraft batteries, barrage balloons, and anti-torpedo nets. They didn't need to sail. Their mere existence pinned Cunningham down, threatening his convoys to Malta and Egypt, and choking the vital artery of the British Empire. This was not merely a raid, it was a calculated, desperate execution. Admiral Cunningham was about to force an answer to the most terrifying question of the new naval age. Could a handful of obsolete aircraft, launched from a steel deck in the dark, neutralize the centuries-old doctrine of battleship supremacy? The impending Battle of Taranto would be the proving ground, a strike designed to prove that the aircraft carrier, not the dreadnought, now held the trident of the sea. Cunningham's frustration with the Italian strategy was palpable. In his autobiography, A Sailor's Odyssey, he wrote of the enemy fleet with characteristic bluntness. Their fleet was living in mortal dread of our own. He knew that as long as they remained at anchor, he could not bring his own battleships to bear. The Italians, he observed, showed no inclination to come out and fight. The strategic paralysis had to be broken. The plan, codenamed Operation Judgement, had been conceived years earlier but was championed and refined by one of his most brilliant subordinates, Rear Admiral Lumley Lyster. Lyster was an aviation zealot, a man who had commanded the carrier HMS Glorious and believed unshakably in the power of the torpedo bomber. He had trained his Swordfish crews relentlessly, practicing night flying and torpedo attacks until they could do it in their sleep. Cunningham, visiting Lyster's new command, Illustrious, had been deeply impressed. He put his full faith in Lyster's plan and in the men of the fleet air arm, later writing, "It was a sad pity that Lumley Lyster was not in chief command. It was he who had trained the squadrons. To him belongs the credit for the brilliant conception and execution of the attack." Cunningham's decision was made. He would risk one of his precious few carriers to cripple the Italian fleet in its lair. The architects of the plan, Lyster and Cunningham, were the macro view. The micro view, the men who would actually fly into the teeth of the guns, were huddled in the briefing rooms of HMS Illustrious. They were the men of 815 and 819 Naval Air Squadrons. Their affection for the Stringbag was baffling to outsiders but perfectly logical to them. The biplane was slow, with a top speed of only 138 miles per hour, making it an easy target for modern fighters. But it was also incredibly stable, durable, and forgiving. It could take off from a short deck, carry a heavy 1,610-pound torpedo, and most importantly, fly low and slow enough to deliver that torpedo with precision in the dark. The men trusted the machine. Leading the first wave of 12 aircraft was Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Hooch Williamson of 815 Squadron. He was a veteran flyer, calm and professional. He and his fellow pilots had studied the intelligence, memorized the maps, and internalized the terrifying reality of their target. They were not flying against a ship at sea. They were attacking a fortress, a little Maginot of naval defense. They knew that barrage balloons, whose cables could shear a wing off, were supposed to be floating over the harbour. They knew that over 100 anti-aircraft guns and scores of machine guns waited for them. They also knew that the harbour was dangerously shallow, a problem that demanded an ingenious and unproven technical solution they were about to test in combat for the first time. At 20:35, the first Swordfish, Williamson's, laboured into the air. The wind howled through its rigging wires, a sound that would soon be drowned out by the roar of its Pegasus engine. One by one, the 12 aircraft of the first wave followed, their blue exhaust flames cutting momentary scars in the blackness. They formed up and set a course north by northwest. A second, smaller wave of 9 planes would follow an hour behind them. In total, 21 aircraft, carrying a combined payload of torpedoes, flares and bombs, were setting off to challenge a fleet that represented the pride of a nation and the mastery of the Mediterranean. As the red and green navigation lights of the formation faded into the northern horizon, a profound silence fell over Illustrious's deck. Cunningham's gamble was underway. The fate of the Mediterranean, and perhaps the future of naval warfare itself, now rested on the fabric wings of those 21 biplanes. To understand the magnitude of the British gamble, one must first understand the fortress they intended to break. The Italian Regia Marina in 1940 was one of the most powerful and modern navies in the world, and it operated under a specific, deeply entrenched doctrine, the flotta in potenza, or fleet in being. This strategy, championed by the Italian Naval High Command, Supermarina, was not one of aggressive confrontation. Italy, with its long, vulnerable coastline, saw its navy as a defensive deterrent. The goal was not to seek out and destroy the Royal Navy in a decisive Jutland-style battle, but to use the threat of its concentrated power to dominate the central Mediterranean. By simply existing, this fleet in being could interdict British convoys, protect Italian supply lines to Libya, and force the Royal Navy to deploy disproportionate strength to contain it. The man commanding this fleet, Admiral Inigo Campioni, was a cautious and traditional battleship sailor. His strategy was one of inaction, of conserving his precious capital ships, believing that their very presence at anchor in Taranto was fulfilling their primary strategic purpose. And what a presence it was! The harbour of Taranto, a massive two-lobed bay in the heel of Italy, held the jewels of the Italian state. Anchored in the outer harbour, the Mar Grande, were 6 of Italy's most powerful battleships, a concentration of firepower that dwarfed Cunningham's entire Mediterranean fleet. The centerpieces were the 2 brand-new, magnificent capital ships of the Littorio class, the Littorio itself and its sister ship, Vittorio Veneto. These were, by any measure, masterpieces of naval engineering. Displacing over 41,000 tons, they were fast, heavily armoured, and mounted 9 15-inch guns in 3 triple turrets. These guns could hurl a 1,951-pound shell over 26 miles. They represented the pinnacle of modern battleship design and were the pride of Mussolini's regime. Alongside them lay 4 older but extensively modernized dreadnoughts. The Conte di Cavour and the Giulio Cesare had been rebuilt from the keel up in the 1,930 seconds, equipped with new engines and more powerful 12.6-inch guns. Anchored nearby were the Caio Duilio and the Andrea Doria, which had just completed similar, even more extensive refits. This combined force of 6 battleships, supported by 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers also present in the harbour, was a steel wall barring the British from the central Mediterranean. The Regia Marina had not left its prized assets unprotected. Taranto was not merely an anchorage, it was a fortress, considered by Italian planners to be the most secure naval base in the kingdom. The defences were layered, deep, and seemingly impenetrable. The harbour was divided into the Mar Grande, outer harbour, and the Mar Piccolo, inner harbour, which held the cruisers and destroyers. The battleships sat in the Mar Grande, shielded from submarine attack by a massive anti-submarine boom and protected from surface attack by coastal batteries. The primary threat, air attack, was thought to be well covered. According to Italian after-action reports and defensive plans, the skies above the harbour were guarded by a formidable array of anti-aircraft artillery. This included 21 heavy 102mm gun batteries on shore, supplemented by dozens of lighter 37mm and 20mm rapid-fire cannons. These were augmented by the anti-aircraft guns of the ships themselves. At night, the sky could be illuminated as bright as day by 22 massive searchlights, designed to blind pilots and pinpoint them for the gunners. To defend against low-level attack, there were two passive defences. First, a system of 87 barrage balloons was designed to float over the anchorage, their dangling steel cables intended to shear the wing off any aircraft flying below 1,000 feet. Second, and most critically, were the anti-torpedo nets. Plans called for 12,800 meters of heavy steel mesh to be suspended in the water, encircling the battleships and designed to stop any torpedo before it reached its target. This combination of active guns, blinding lights, passive balloons, and underwater nets created an environment that Supermarina considered impregnable to aerial torpedo assault. But all these defences paled in comparison to their single greatest defence, the water itself. The Italian High Command, along with virtually every other naval power in the world, operated on a fatal assumption. It was universally accepted naval doctrine that an aerial torpedo, when dropped from a plane, would dive steeply, requiring a depth of at least 75, and ideally 100, feet of water to level out arm itself and begin its run toward the target. The Mar Grande at Taranto was notoriously shallow. Extensive surveys confirmed the depth at the battleship anchorages was, at most, 40 to 45 feet. Therefore, any torpedo dropped by an aircraft would simply plunge directly into the thick mud of the seabed. This calculation was the bedrock of Taranto's defence. Admiral Campione and his staff slept soundly, believing that while bombs might harass them, a crippling torpedo strike, the only kind of aerial attack that could truly threaten a battleship, was a physical, technical, and tactical impossibility. This single fatal assumption was the crack in the fortress wall. It was a vulnerability the British, driven by desperation, were already well on their way to solving with a piece of ingenious, makeshift engineering. The plan, codenamed Operation Judgement, was not a desperate improvisation. It was the culmination of one man's visionary, almost fanatical, belief in naval aviation. That man was Rear Admiral Lumley Lister. Lister was a true believer in a navy still dominated by the battleship admirals, men who saw aircraft as useful scouts but not as decisive capital ship killers. Lister, who had commanded the carrier HMS Glorious and now flew his flag on Illustrious, saw things differently. He had spent his career developing the doctrines of carrier warfare, particularly the complex and dangerous art of night operations. He viewed the fairy Swordfish not as an obsolete biplane, but as the most effective torpedo delivery system in the world. When Admiral Cunningham found himself stymied by the Italian fleet in being, it was Lister who stepped forward with a ready-made, albeit terrifying, solution. He was the plan's architect, and HMS Illustrious was the instrument he had forged for this exact purpose. The origins of Operation Judgement stretched back 5 years to a 1,935 fleet exercise in the Mediterranean. In a war game designed to test fleet defences, Lister, then in command of Glorious, had proposed a radical, heretical idea. He suggested that his Swordfish, under the cover of darkness, could launch a mock torpedo strike against the main fleet anchored in the supposedly safe harbour of Alexandria. The idea was met with scepticism, even ridicule. But Lister executed it flawlessly. His biplanes, navigating by starlight and dead reckoning, sank several of the Royal Navy's most powerful battleships. The exercise was a stunning success, but its lessons were largely ignored by a naval establishment still wedded to the 16-inch gun. Lister, however, did not forget. He filed the plan away, refining its details, waiting for the moment when necessity would overcome dogma. In November 1940, with Taranto paralyzing the fleet, Lister presented his 1,935 Alexandria plan to Cunningham, modified for a real-world target. Cunningham, a far more flexible and aggressive thinker than his peers, saw its brutal genius and greenlit it. The strategic why behind the raid was not merely to sink ships, it was to provide a shield for the most complex logistical operation the Royal Navy had yet attempted in the Mediterranean. Operation Judgement was the offensive component of a much larger mission, Operation MB8. This was a massive, multi-part convoy operation designed to resupply the besieged island of Malta, Operation ME3, bring troops and supplies to Greece, Operation AN6, and reinforce Cunningham's own fleet in Alexandria from Gibraltar, Operation Coat. These convoys, slow and laden with fuel, ammunition, and men, would have to sail directly through the choke point of the central Mediterranean. Cunningham knew from his dispatches that if Admiral Campione's fleet sailed from Taranto, it would mean the annihilation of these convoys and the potential collapse of the British position in the Mediterranean. In his own words, the Taranto fleet was a standing menace which tethered our battle fleet to the eastward. He could not be in two places at once. He had to choose, either cower in Alexandria to protect the convoys, or proactively, violently, remove the Italian fleet from the equation. He chose the latter. Operation Judgement was a preemptive strike, a necessary and ruthless act of aggression to ensure the survival of his defensive supply lines. This audacious plan, however, was entirely dependent on perfect, up to the minute intelligence. A blind attack was impossible. This is where the eyes from Malta became the plan's indispensable enabler. The linchpin of the British intelligence effort was No. 431 General Reconnaissance Flight of the Royal Air Force, based on the besieged island of Malta. Flying unarmed, high-speed Martin Maryland bombers, these crews undertook missions of incredible peril, flying high-altitude photographic sorties directly over Italy's most heavily defended naval base. Their work was meticulous and fraught with danger. On November 10th, just 24 hours before the planned launch, a Maryland aircraft screamed over Taranto, its cameras capturing the vital images. The film was rushed back to Malta, developed, and then flown by a short Sunderland flying boat directly to HMS Illustrious at sea. On the carrier, intelligence officers and pilots pored over the wet prints. They built a 3D model of the harbour in the briefing room, identifying the precise location of every Italian battleship. But these photos revealed something even more critical, the fatal flaws in the Italian defence. They confirmed that a recent storm had torn away many of the barrage balloons. More importantly, the photographs clearly showed that the anti-torpedo nets, which were supposed to encircle the battleships, were incomplete. There were significant, gaping holes in the Margrand anchorage. The plan was now set. Leicester's heretical vision from 1935 was now a fully fledged operation. Cunningham's absolute strategic need for the attack was clear and present. The pilots of the Fleet Air Arm were trained to a razor's edge in the art of night torpedo bombing. The RAF's intelligence had provided the keys to the castle, revealing the precise targets and the gaps in their defences. Every piece was in place for one of the most decisive actions in naval history. But all of it, the years of planning, the strategic necessity, the courage of the pilots, and the pinpoint intelligence was utterly meaningless if the torpedoes, upon being dropped, buried themselves in the mud of Taranto's 40-foot deep harbour. The entire operation, and the fate of the Mediterranean, now rested on a single, unsolved technical problem that every naval engineer in the world, including most in the Royal Navy, believed to be impossible. The entire audacious gamble of Operation Judgement rested on a single, crippling problem of physics. The weapon of choice, the Royal Navy's standard Mark XII aerial torpedo, was a 1,610-pound monster, 17 feet long. Like all aerial torpedoes of its day, it was designed for the open ocean. When dropped from an aircraft moving at over 100 knots, its sheer weight and momentum would cause it to plunge violently into the sea, reaching a depth of at least 75 feet, and often closer to 100, before its hydrostatic rudder could catch, level it out, and arm its 388-pound warhead. Only then would it begin its high-speed run toward the target. This was a known, accepted, and universal limitation. The problem was Taranto. The Italian admirals knew, and the British reconnaissance photos confirmed, that the Margrand anchorage was a shallow basin. The water at the battleship anchorages was, at its deepest, a mere 40 to 45 feet. Underneath that was a thick, unforgiving layer of primeval mud. Any standard torpedo dropped by the Swordfish would not level out. It would simply dive, unstoppable, nose, first into the seabed, burying itself harmlessly. The 39-foot problem, as it became known, was not just a hurdle, it was a full stop. It was the entire foundation of the Italian defensive strategy. The solution was not born of high-tech research or sophisticated naval laboratories. It was a desperate, ingenious, and utterly jury-rigged piece of field engineering, a testament to wartime improvisation. The problem, British engineers realized, was not the depth of the torpedo's run. It could be set to run at 30 feet, but the depth of its initial entry. They had to find a way to stop its 1,600-pound mass from plunging. The answer they devised was crude, cheap, and brilliant. A simple wooden drum, looking much like a large spool of thread, with a metal band of thin-gauge wire wrapped around it. This drum was attached by a small bracket to the nose of the torpedo, just ahead of the warhead. This was not a device to make the torpedo float. Its purpose was purely aerodynamic and hydrodynamic, designed to act as a massive, flat-surfaced air brake the instant it hit the water. The physics were brutal and simple. As the torpedo entered the sea, this flat surface, travelling at over 100 knots, would hit the incompressible water and create immense drag. This drag would violently counteract the torpedo's natural dive, pitching the weapon's tail up and forcing the entire torpedo into a horizontal belly flop almost instantly upon entry. It would skip, slam, and splash, but it would not dive. This violent, shallow entry would, in theory, allow the torpedo to stabilize in less than 30 feet of water and begin its deadly run. This theory, however, required frantic testing. At the Royal Navy's torpedo testing range at Ablaze, Scotland, and in the waters off Alexandria, pilots and engineers worked in a near panic to see if this wooden contraption would actually work. The initial results were disastrous. Primary accounts from this period described the immense frustration. Torpedoes fitted with the drums were dropped, and many simply vanished, the drums disintegrating on impact or failing to stop the dive, resulting in another valuable piece of ordnance lost in the mud. Other tests showed the drums would be torn off in the slipstream, or that the impact of the belly flop was so violent it damaged the torpedo's sensitive internal mechanisms, its gyroscopes and rudders. But with each failure, the design was tweaked. The precise diameter of the drum, the strength of the bracket, the number of wire wraps, all were adjusted. Finally, in the last weeks before the raid, they achieved a breakthrough. A Swordfish, mimicking the attack profile, dropped its payload. The drum hit the water, there was a massive spray, and the torpedo, instead of diving, was seen to leap forward, its motor roaring to life, its wake visible just feet below the surface. It worked. It was ugly, it was violent, but it worked. This jury-rigged solution, a simple modification of wood and wire, had just defeated the fundamental laws of naval ordnance. The Swordfish of 815 and 819 squadrons were now armed with a secret weapon, one that no naval textbook or intelligence service in the world believed could exist. The modification was so simple that it could be fitted to the torpedoes by the carrier's own ordnance crews. As the armourers on Illustrious wheeled the torpedoes from the magazines on the afternoon of November 11th, they were not just loading munitions, they were loading a physics, defying trick. The Italian fleet in Taranto rested comfortably, protected by their harbour's shallow water, a fact of geography they believed made them invulnerable to the torpedo, the only weapon an aircraft carried that could truly kill a battleship. They put their faith in the known, accepted, and unchanging laws of hydrodynamics. The British, with their 21 obsolete-looking biplanes, betting the entire fate of the Mediterranean, were now armed with a piece of wood and wire that was designed to shatter those very laws. The stage was set, the weapon was proven, and the first wave was about to be unleashed. At 20:35, the deck of Illustrious transformed. The order to start engines was given, and the night air was shattered by the sound of 12 Bristol Pegasus radial engines barking to life, one after another, in a deafening, percussive roar. The biplanes, straining at their chocks, seemed to shudder with a life of their own. The air, already cold, was now whipped into a freezing slipstream smelling of exhaust and high-test fuel. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson in the lead aircraft gave a final thumbs up. At 20:40, the first Swordfish, his own, roared down the flight deck, its wheels leaving the steel runway with agonizing slowness, and dipped perilously close to the dark waves before clawing its way into the sky. One by one, the others followed, each a dark, crucifix-like shape against the faint starlight. Within minutes, all 12 aircraft of the first wave were airborne, forming a loose, dark constellation. They set their course north by northwest for the 170-mile flight. Below them, Illustrious turned away, disappearing into the blackness, leaving them utterly alone. This first wave was not the blunt instrument it appeared to be. It was a sophisticated, two-pronged weapon, and its design is what makes the thesis title, How 6 British Swordfish Crippled the Entire Italian Fleet, so precise. Of the 12 aircraft flying north, only 6 were the true capital ship killers. These 6, led by Williamson himself, were armed with the new, secret, shallow-water modified Mark XII torpedoes. Their sole, dedicated targets were the 6 battleships anchored in the Mar Grande. The other 6 aircraft in the formation had entirely different, though equally vital, roles. They were the enablers, the diversion, the pathfinders. 2 of these aircraft, led by Lieutenant N.J. Blood Scarlet, were armed with a mix of flares and 250-pound bombs. The other 4 aircraft carried only flares, massive parachute-retarded illuminators designed to drift slowly down and turn the pitch-black harbour into an artificially lit stage. This second group's mission was twofold. First, to drop their flares over the Mar Grande to perfectly silhouette the battleships for the torpedo planes. Second, to fly to the Mar Piccolo, the inner harbour, and begin dive-bombing the cruisers and the massive oil storage depot. This diversion was critical. It was designed to draw the attention of the Italian anti-aircraft gunners, to make them fire at the flashes in the inner harbour, pulling their aim away from the low, slow-flying torpedo planes coming in from the west. The 3-hour flight was a grueling ordeal of endurance and precision. The crews sat in open cockpits, exposed to a relentless, freezing wind that cut through their leather flying gear, leaving their hands and faces numb. They flew in total radio silence, a tiny cluster of machines in an ocean of blackness. Navigation was by dead reckoning, compass, and the faint glimmer of the stars. In his post-action report, Lieutenant M.R. Dickie Maund, piloting one of Williamson's torpedo planes, captured the intense strain. The flight was uneventful, except for the cold, which was intense. One relies entirely on one's instruments. There is no sensation of speed, and a sort of feeling of detachment. This detachment was a mental armour against the anxiety. They flew over 100 miles of open water, then crossed the dark, hostile coast of Italy, their engines' roar seeming, to them, loud enough to wake the dead. Their eyes strained for the coastline, for the faint, familiar shape of the heel of Italy. Below, the dark, sleeping landscape offered no comfort. only the promise of the inferno to come. As they neared the target area, the formation split as planned. Williamson, leading the 6 torpedo bombers, signaled to his group, and they throttled back, descending to just a few thousand feet. They began a wide, circling approach to the west of Taranto, positioning themselves to fly in over the breakwater, directly at the row of battleships. The other 6 aircraft, the flare force led by Scarlet, maintained their altitude and continued directly toward the harbour. The tension in Williamson's cockpit was unbearable. His observé, Lieutenant N.J. Dusty Miller, was hunched over his maps and the crude aerial photos, confirming their attack run. Their target, identified from the Malta reconnaissance, was the Conte di Cavour, the flagship. They strained their eyes in the dark, searching for the first sign of the harbour's defences, the loom of the searchlights, the cables of the barrage balloons, or the muzzle flash of an anti-aircraft gun. For now, there was nothing. The fortress of Taranto lay dark and silent, utterly unaware of the doom descending upon it. It was 22:58. The raid began. Blood Scarlet's lead aircraft, poised high above the Mar Piccolo, released its first string of parachute flares. They ignited with a blinding, chemical white glare. Suddenly, shockingly, the entire harbour was illuminated as if by a malevolent daylight. The flares drifted slowly down, casting hard black shadows. Far below, the pilots in Williamson's torpedo bomber wing saw it all laid bare. The calm water of the Mar Grande, the geometric lines of the breakwater, and, most terrifying and beautiful of all, the 6 massive black shapes of the Italian battleships, a forest of masts perfectly silhouetted, sitting like ducks in a pond. In that same instant, the harbour exploded. The flares had done their job, and the fortress was awake. The flares ignited at 22:58. In an instant, the black harbour was transformed into a grotesque, overlit stage. As the magnesium-white light drifted down, high-altitude anti-aircraft shells began bursting in puffs of black smoke, their flashes adding to the strobing chaos. Simultaneously, Blood Scarlet's diversionary force went to work on the Mar Piccolo. His Swordfish peeled off and dove, screaming down on the oil storage depot. Their bombs struck true. A catastrophic bright orange fireball erupted into the sky, a massive secondary explosion that lit the entire city and sent a column of roiling black smoke thousands of feet into the air. This, as planned, drew the immediate, panicked attention of dozens of Italian anti-aircraft batteries. Tracers, red, green, and white, began arcing inland, away from the Mar Grande, exactly as Lister had hoped. At that exact moment, under the cover of this manufactured chaos, Lieutenant Commander Williamson led his 6 torpedo planes down. They dove from 4,000 feet, engines throttled back to a dull roar, levelling out at a suicidal 30 feet above the water. They were so low they were under the trajectory of the main barrage and, critically, below the altitude of the few barrage balloon cables the storm had not destroyed. Williamson, with his observer Lieutenant Dusty Miller, was first. They were flying directly into a wall of fire. Miller's after-action report, written with the cold precision of a professional, captured the hellscape. I saw the line of battleships. I was impressed by the blaze of the oil depot. The Cavour was the first battleship in the western line. We went straight for her. They were flying so low that Miller could clearly see the Italian sailors on the decks, running to their action stations. Tracers streamed past their fabric wings. Our aircraft was hit almost at once, Miller reported, but the engine kept going. Williamson held the Stringbag steady, ignoring the damage, his eyes fixed on the Conte di Cavour. At a range of just 700 yards, he released the torpedo. The 1,610-pound fish, with its jury-rigged wooden drum, hit the water with a massive splash, did its belly flop perfectly, and sped off. Miller watched, holding his breath. A few seconds later, he wrote, the torpedo struck. There was a colossal explosion. A great column of smoke, water and debris was flung up, higher than the ship's masthead. They had done it. The impossible weapon had worked. But their triumph was short-lived. The flak, which had been hitting them throughout their run, finally found a vital artery. The engine coughed, caught fire, and seized. Williamson, fighting the controls, managed to bring the burning biplane down, executing a perfect water landing in the middle of the harbour. They clambered out as the Cavour began to settle, its bow sinking, and were captured by an Italian picket boat. The next plane in line was piloted by Lieutenant Dickie Maund, with his observer Lieutenant John Flay. Maund's later account became legendary. The whole place was ablaze with tracer. Searchlights were everywhere, waving about, and it was rather like a daylight attack. The diversion in the Mar Piccolo was working, but the defences in the Mar Grande were now fully alert. Maund descended to 40 feet, jinking and weaving to throw off the gunner's aim. He saw the sinking Cavour and the gap where Williamson's plane should have been. He pressed on, aiming for the next ship in line, the brand-new, formidable Littorio. The flak was, in his words, a solid wall of stuff. To line up his shot, Maund made a split-second decision. He flew his biplane between the bows of the Littorio and the Andrea Doria, a gap of only a few hundred yards. Gunners on both battleships were now firing at him. It was not very comfortable, he dryly noted. He levelled out, his target, the Littorio, now a massive black wall in his windscreen. At 400 yards, a range he called ridiculously close, he dropped his torpedo. He banked the Swordfish so hard its wings were nearly vertical, wrenching it around to escape the crossfire. His observer, Flay, looked back. There was an agonizing wait, Maund recalled. And then, a great column of water shot up, then another flash and a second column of water as the warhead itself detonated against the hull. The Littorio was hit, hard, on its starboard bow. The attack was not over. The 6 were not finished. The 3rd and 4th torpedo planes, piloted by Lieutenant G.W.L.A. Grieve and Lieutenant J.W.G. Wellman, were right behind Maund. They, too, flew into the same inferno. They saw Maund's torpedo strike the Littorio. Rather than switching targets, they decided to finish the job, to ensure the new battleship was truly crippled. Both pilots pressed their attacks with suicidal bravery. Grieve, like Maund, flew low and fast, dropping his torpedo which ran true, striking the Littorio again, this time on the starboard quarter, near the stern. Wellman followed, enduring the same barrage, and planted a 3rd torpedo into the stricken dreadnought. The Littorio, a ship that represented the pinnacle of Italian naval power, was now gushing water from 3 massive torpedo wounds, its bow sinking, its stern heavily damaged. In less than 5 minutes, the 6 torpedo planes of the first wave had achieved the impossible. They had crippled 2 battleships, one of them brand new, for the cost of 1 aircraft. The surviving 5 Swordfish, their torpedoes gone, dove for the deck. They banked hard, flying just feet above the waves, exiting the harbour as fast as their 138 mile-per-hour top speed would allow. Behind them, Taranto was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The oil depot was a raging fire. The sky was filled with smoke and the criss-crossing lines of tracers, and the Conte di Cavour was visibly sinking at its mooring. The Littorio was listing heavily, its forecastle already awash. The Italian defences were in chaos, their gunners firing wildly at shadows, their command structure shattered by the speed and ferocity of an attack they believed was physically impossible. As the British pilots cleared the breakwater and set course for the open sea and the safety of Illustrious, they looked back at the carnage. They believed the worst was over. But 170 miles away, flying through the same cold night air, the 9 Swordfish of the second wave, led by Lieutenant Commander J.W. Hale, were already approaching. The hammer was about to fall again. The surviving pilots of the first wave were met by the 9 Swordfish of the second wave, led by Lieutenant Commander J.W. Hale, as they flew their separate courses. Hale's group had launched from Illustrious almost an hour after Williamson's, and had followed the same cold, dark 170-mile path. But the target they were approaching was radically different from the one the first wave had found. As they neared Taranto at approximately 2350, they saw not a sleeping harbour, but a vision of hell. The massive oil depot fire in the Mar Piccolo was still raging, a towering pillar of orange flame that cast a flickering, demonic light over the entire area, silhouetting the city and the harbour. The smoke, thick and acrid, choked the sky, making navigation treacherous, and the defences were now fully, hysterically, awake. Every anti-aircraft gun in the fortress, from the heavy 102mm batteries to the rapid-fire 20mm cannons, was firing. The sky was a dense, three-dimensional web of tracers, the air pockmarked by the black puffs of flak. The searchlights, no longer probing but fixed, swept the smoke, desperate to catch a target. This was the inferno Hale had to lead his 9 planes into. Hale's wave, like the first, was a mixed force. 5 aircraft carried torpedoes, while 4 carried bombs and flares. Their job was to finish whatever the first wave had started. Hale led his torpedo section down through the flak, levelling off at 30 feet, just as Williamson had. He flew straight into the Mar Grande, the water around him churned by shell splashes. His primary target, as briefed, had been the Littorio, but as he steadied his Stringbag for the attack run, he could see in the flickering firelight that the Littorio was already crippled, its bow submerged, its stern low in the water. He also saw the Conte di Cavour, a dark, listing wreck. Hale made a split-second combat decision. He shifted his aim to the next battleship in the line, the Caio Duilio, another of the modernized dreadnoughts, which so far sat untouched. According to his after-action report, Hale flew through a screen of ships and dropped his torpedo at a range of 800 yards. He held the aircraft steady, flying directly at the ship, before banking hard to escape. He and his observer, Lieutenant G.S.W., Bobby Lanyon, looked back. They saw the telltale white streak of the torpedo's wake, followed by a bright flash and a massive column of water erupting against the Duilio's hull. It was a perfect hit, striking the battleship on its starboard side, forward of the main turrets. The rest of the torpedo bombers followed their leader into the fray. Lieutenant G. Bailey, flying with his observer Lieutenant H. J. Burt Slaughter, was next. They too saw Hale's torpedo strike the Duilio. Like the pilots who had ganged up on the Littorio in the first wave, Bailey decided to make sure of the kill. He flew his Swordfish through the same barrage of fire, the tracers seeming to come from all directions, as other pilots reported. Bailey lined up his shot on the now damaged Duilio and dropped his torpedo. The belly flop modification worked again. The torpedo ran hot and true, striking the Caio Duilio in a second, devastating blow. The battleship, hit twice in quick succession, was doomed. A massive hole was torn in its hull, flooding its forward magazines. But as Bailey banked away, his escape was cut off. A string of 20mm tracers, fired from a nearby cruiser, ripped through the Swordfish's fabric fuselage. The engine exploded, and the aircraft plunged into the Mar Grande, killing both Bailey and Slaughter. They were the second, and final, aircraft loss of the night. While the torpedo planes were eviscerating the battleships in the Mar Grande, the 4 bomb and flare carrying Swordfish of Hale's wave were executing their own mission. They had a different target list. They ignored the battleships and flew directly over the barrage to the Mar Piccolo, the inner harbour, where the Italian cruisers and destroyers were anchored. Their goal was to add to the chaos, to demonstrate that no ship in Taranto, no matter how small or how safe in the inner anchorage, was beyond the reach of the fleet air arm. They selected their targets with methodical precision. One Swordfish dove on the heavy cruiser Trento, releasing its stick of 250-pound bombs. One bomb struck the cruiser, penetrating its deck and causing significant damage, though it failed to explode. Another Swordfish targeted the destroyer Libeccio, and its bombs struck nearby, riddling the ship's superstructure with shrapnel. These bomb attacks, while not as decisive as the torpedo strikes, were a vital part of the psychological devastation. They proved that the entire harbour, from the outer breakwater to the inner basin, was indefensible. The raid was over. The surviving 7 aircraft of the second wave, their ordnance expended, dove to sea level and raced for the exit, flying low and fast over the breakwater. Behind them, they left a scene of total, catastrophic destruction. The smoke from the oil depot and the burning ships was so thick it blacked out the sky. The harbour, which 90 minutes earlier had been the secure fortress of the Regia Marina, was now a graveyard. The Conte di Cavour was sinking, its decks awash, a total loss. The brand-new Littorio was on the bottom, its forecastle submerged, with 3 massive torpedo wounds in its hull. The Caio Duilio was also sinking, its bow compartments completely flooded from 2 torpedo hits. 3 capital ships, 3 of the 6 battleships that formed the core of the fleet in being, had been neutralized in 90 minutes by 21 obsolete biplanes. The impossible had been definitively, brutally, and efficiently achieved. The full accounting of the night's work, the true butcher's bill, could now be calculated. Long after midnight, the operations room of HMS Illustrious was a tomb of silent tension. Admiral Cunningham, Admiral Lister, and the carrier's captain, Dennis Boyd, stood around the plotting table, chain-smoking, waiting. The only sound was the grease pencil of the plotter, tracking the estimated return time of the aircraft and the hum of the ship's ventilation. Then, at 1:20, a faint report from the radio room. Aircraft in sight. Men rushed to the freezing flight deck. They were not the pristine machines that had left 4 hours earlier. The 19 surviving Swordfish appeared out of the darkness, one by one, their engines sputtering on the last of their fuel. They were exhausted, riddled with flak holes, their fabric wings torn and shredded by shrapnel. Pilots, numb with cold and adrenaline, stumbled from their cockpits, their faces smeared with oil and cordite. One pilot's account described the sheer physical exhaustion. My legs were shaking so much from the cold and the release of tension that I could barely stand. The debriefing was frantic. The crews, gulping down hot tea laced with rum, all told the same story. Cavour, hit. Littorio, hit. Twice, maybe 3 times. Duilio, hit. Definitely. Then, the grim accounting. 2 aircraft did not return. Williamson and Miller, the leaders of the first wave, and Bailey and Slaughter from the second. The total British cost for the night was tallied: 2 aircraft, 2 men killed, 2 men captured. As dawn broke over Taranto harbour on November 12th, the full, catastrophic extent of the butcher's bill became clear to the Italians. The scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. The massive oil depot fire still burned, casting a pall of thick black smoke over the entire Mar Grande. The water was a slick of black furnace oil, inches thick, making rescue efforts a living nightmare. Italian after-action reports described the desperate attempts to save men trapped in the sinking hulls. On the Conte di Cavour, the torpedo had struck near the bow, detonating in a magazine and tearing a 40-foot hole in its hull. It sank rapidly by the bow, settling in the shallow mud. 17 men were killed, many trapped in the flooded forward compartments. On the Caio Duilio, the 2 torpedoes had ripped a 36-foot hole, flooding the forward magazines and killing 3 officers and 14 men. The ship settled by the bow, its forecastle awash. The worst human cost was on the Littorio. The 3 torpedo hits had caused massive flooding and a severe list, though its modern armour and compartmentalisation had saved it from gibberish. The cost versus result analysis of the Battle of Taranto is one of the most lopsided in the history of warfare. For decades, Admiral Cunningham had been frustrated by the Italian fleet in being. His own massive battleships, Warspite, Malaya, and Valiant, with their 15-inch guns, could not dislodge the Italians from their fortress. What the entire Royal Navy surface fleet could not achieve, what was considered a strategic impossibility, was accomplished in one night by 21 fabric-covered biplanes and their 42 crewmen. The sheer efficiency of the raid was terrifying. The British had risked 1 aircraft carrier and a handful of planes. In return, they had fundamentally and instantly altered the balance of naval power in the entire Mediterranean theatre. The strategic victory was absolute, and its cost was, by the brutal mathematics of war, almost negligible. The Stringbag, the obsolete joke, had just proven itself to be the most cost-effective capital ship killer in the world. The shockwaves of this realization were about to be felt not just in Rome, but in every naval admiralty on the planet. The smoking wrecks in Taranto harbour were not just a tactical victory. They were the epicenter of a strategic earthquake that instantly redrew the entire map of the Mediterranean. When the sun rose on November 12, 1940, the brutal arithmetic of naval power had been irrevocably altered. For months, Admiral Cunningham had been hamstrung by the Regia Marina's 6 battleships. Now, in 90 minutes, that number had been operationally reduced to 3. The Conte di Cavour was a permanent loss. The Littorio and Caio Duilio, even if salvaged, were out of the war for at least 5 to 6 months, a lifetime in a conflict where control of the sea lanes was decided weekly. The fleet in being doctrine, which had held the Mediterranean in paralysis, had been shattered in a single night by 21 biplanes. The balance of power, as Cunningham later wrote, had been radically changed. In Rome, at the headquarters of Supermarina, the reaction was not one of defiance, but of pure, unadulterated panic. The first reports from Taranto were so catastrophic, so unbelievable, that the High Command initially dismissed them as hysterical exaggerations. How could obsolete biplanes sink 3 battleships in a fortress believed to be invulnerable? But as the coded messages from Admiral Campioni confirmed the full extent of the disaster, disbelief turned to dread. The primary evidence of their panic was not in a written communiqué, but in the immediate, frantic, and strategically devastating order they issued. On the morning of November 12th, Supermarina decreed that Taranto was no longer a safe anchorage. It was a death trap. Every remaining operational capital ship was to leave, immediately. This was not a tactical redeployment. It was a rout. This order triggered a desperate, humiliating flight. The 3 surviving battleships, the brand new Vittorio Veneto, which had been in Taranto but was mercifully untouched, the modernized Giulio Cesare, and the Andrea Doria frantically raised steam. Along with their cruiser and destroyer screens, they sailed from Taranto, the scene of their fleet's greatest humiliation, and fled north. Their new safe harbour was to be Naples. This single move was, in itself, a colossal strategic victory for the British, perhaps even greater than the sinking of the ships themselves. By relocating to Naples, the Italian fleet was now hundreds of miles further away from the critical choke point in the central Mediterranean, the Sicilian Narrows, through which all of the vital British convoys to Malta and Egypt had to pass. The fleet in being was no longer in being. It was a fleet in hiding. It had voluntarily ceded control of the central Mediterranean to Cunningham, its fangs drawn, its threat neutered. The strategic purpose of Operation Judgement, to clear the way for the Malta convoys, had been achieved beyond Cunningham's wildest dreams. Admiral Cunningham himself, back on Illustrious, received the news of the Italian withdrawal with grim satisfaction. In his autobiography, A Sailor's Odyssey, he summed up the immediate payoff with his characteristic understatement: the sailing of these convoys was now carried out without interference. This simple sentence concealed a tectonic strategic shift. The convoys of Operation MB8, the very reason for the Taranto raid, sailed through the Sicilian Narrows and arrived at Malta and Alexandria completely unmolested. The tons of supplies, ammunition, and men were delivered, and the British position in the Mediterranean was secured. For Cunningham, the victory was personal. The standing menace that had tethered his own battle fleet to the eastern Mediterranean was gone. He was no longer a jailer, forced to watch a prisoner he couldn't touch. He was now the master of the sea. His fleet, spearheaded by the now proven power of Illustrious, had strategic freedom. He could go on the offensive, hunt Italian convoys to Libya, and support the army in North Africa, all without constantly looking over his shoulder at the threat from Taranto. The British victory at Taranto was total. It was a masterpiece of planning, intelligence, engineering, and raw courage. It would be studied, rightly, as the textbook example of naval air power, but history is rarely a one-sided story. The impenetrable fortress of Taranto did not fall just because the British were brilliant or brave. It fell because it was, in fact, a hollow shell. The victory was a dual narrative, built as much on catastrophic, self-inflicted Italian failures as it was on British ingenuity. The dual conflict was not just between the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina, but within the Italian High Command itself, a conflict between arrogance, incompetence, and the harsh reality of a war they were unprepared to fight. The gaping holes in Taranto's defences were not all physical. The most fatal ones were psychological. The British victory was a masterpiece of audacity, but it was a victory that was only made possible by a catastrophic, self-inflicted failure on the part of the Italian defenders. The impenetrable fortress of Taranto was, in reality, a hollow facade, crippled by an internal dual conflict that raged within the Italian High Command. This was not a conflict of arms, but one of psychology, the fatal clash between the supermarina's peacetime arrogance and the brutal, non-negotiable realities of a new kind of war. The Italian admirals had become so thoroughly convinced by their own doctrine that the 40-foot depth of the harbour made a torpedo attack a physical impossibility that they viewed their layered defences as mere formalities. This arrogance bred a deep-seated, systemic complacency that rotted the defences from the inside out, leaving the fleet exposed. The first, and most critical, of these failures was the state of the anti-torpedo nets. Italian defensive plans, as drawn up, were meticulous. They called for 12,800 metres of heavy steel netting to be suspended from buoys, completely encircling the 6 battleships anchored in the Mar Grande. Had this plan been executed, Williamson's and Hale's torpedoes would have detonated harmlessly, hundreds of yards from their targets. But the plan was not executed. Post-battle Italian inquiries revealed a shocking truth. On the night of November 11th, only 4,200 metres of netting, roughly one-third of the required amount, was actually in the water. The gaps were enormous, leaving the battleships, particularly on their landward side, completely exposed. The reasons for this failure were a cocktail of bureaucratic incompetence and that same fatal arrogance. There were industrial shortages of steel netting, and the deployment was a slow, difficult, and low-priority task for the harbour defence crews. Why rush to deploy heavy, cumbersome nets, the prevailing logic went, when the harbour's shallow water already provided a perfect, natural defence? This assumption, this core belief in the impossible, meant the nets were never treated with the urgency they deserved. This was the exact gap the British reconnaissance photos from Malta had identified. The pilots on Illustrious were not flying in blind. They were attacking a specific, known, and photographed vulnerability. The second, equally catastrophic, failure was the absence of the barrage balloons. The defensive plan called for 87 balloons to be moored to buoys and barges, floating at an altitude of 1,000 feet, their dangling steel cables designed to shear the wing off any aircraft attempting a low-level attack. This was the Regia Marina's primary defence against the exact kind of assault the Swordfish were practicing. But on the night of the raid, the sky was almost completely empty. Italian base logs, examined by furious investigators after the attack, told the story. On November 6th and 7th, just days before, a strong storm had swept through Taranto, ripping 60 of the balloons from their moorings and sending them drifting away. This left the harbour, particularly on its western approach, the exact route Williamson's first wave used, wide open. In a fleet on high alert, this would have been a crisis, and every available resource would have been used to replace the balloons immediately. But at Taranto, there was no urgency. The storm was seen as an annoyance, not a critical breach of security. Again, the psychological rot had set in. Why waste the resources and manpower to replace balloons meant to stop an attack that could never happen? The remaining 27 balloons were clustered over the Mar Piccolo, leaving the Mar Grande and its battleships naked. These physical failures were symptomatic of the final and most profound failure, the complete lack of operational readiness. The fortress was asleep. Despite vague warnings of a possible British fleet operation, Taranto was not on high alert. When Blood Scarlet's flares first illuminated the harbour, they were met not with an instant coordinated barrage, but with a few seconds of stunned silence, followed by a chaotic, uncoordinated, and panicked response. Post-battle accounts from Italian sailors describe mass confusion. Many anti-aircraft gun crews, both on shore and on the ships, were not at their stations. Some were on shore leave in the city, others were asleep below decks. There was no centralized fire control. The shipboard guns, firing at the low-flying Swordfish, were just as likely to be hitting the shore batteries, which were in turn firing at the ships. The searchlight crews, blinded by their own flares and the massive oil fire, swept their beams wildly through the smoke, illuminating nothing. The British pilots described flying through a wall of fire, but it was a wall that was blind, unaimed, and hysterical. The attack was a total surprise, not just tactically, but psychologically. It was an assault on the very bedrock of the Regia Marina's defensive doctrine, and in the 90 minutes that mattered, they had no answer. At 22:50 on the night of November 11th, the battleship Littorio was a floating citadel of peace. She was the pride of the Regia Marina, a 41,000-ton behemoth of steel and 15-inch guns, resting at her mooring in the Mar Grande. On her decks, the night watch proceeded with the dull routine of a fleet in harbour. Sailors, wrapped against the night's chill, patrolled their stations, their footsteps echoing on the steel. In the distance, the lights of Taranto city glittered. The atmosphere was one of profound, almost arrogant security. This was their fortress. The crews, many of them new to this magnificent warship, felt invincible. They were protected by the harbour's shallow water, by the nets, by the balloons, and by the sheer firepower of their own ship. The war was something that happened far away, on the open sea. It was not something that could reach them here, in the safest naval base in Italy. This peacetime illusion was shattered at 22:58. A series of brilliant, blinding flashes lit the sky, as bright as day, one officer reported. The flares, hanging silently from their parachutes, cast a ghastly white light over the entire anchorage. The first, confused thought on the Littorio's bridge was that it was a false alarm, or perhaps a minor, high-altitude bombing raid by a stray RAF plane from Malta. Then came the sound, a low, buzzing roar, like a swarm of hornets, as one survivor described it. And then, the impossible sight. Out of the western darkness, flying impossibly low at mast height, reports stated came the silhouettes of biplanes. Not modern bombers, but ancient-looking machines of fabric and wire. The shock on the deck was total. Before the anti-aircraft gunners, many of whom were just tumbling out of their bunks, could even aim their weapons, the first Swordfish, piloted by Dickie Maund, was on them, a dark shape against the new, raging fire of the oil depot. A splash was seen, and then a cataclysmic shudder. The first torpedo struck the Littorio's starboard bow. An Italian officer's after-action report described it as a deafening roar and a violent lurch that threw men from their feet. The invincible battleship had been hit, in its impossible harbour, by a torpedo. The chaos was immediate. Before the damage control teams could even get the reports, before the klaxons had finished sounding, the second and third torpedoes, from Greaves and Wellman, slammed into the ship. The impacts were devastating, one striking the starboard quarter, the other tearing another massive hole in the bow. The Littorio lurched again, far more violently. A sailor's account described the lights going out instantly, plunging the decks below into absolute, terrifying darkness. The ship, he wrote, felt as if its spine had been broken. Down in the engineering spaces, the roar of incoming water was like a freight train. Men screamed, trapped in compartments that were flooding in seconds. The acrid smell of high explosives filled the air. Damage control teams, wading through freezing, oil-slicked water in the blackness, fought a heroic but losing battle. The ship was listing heavily to starboard. and the bow was sinking. The flooding was too massive, the holes too large. Their brand new, unsinkable dreadnought, the most powerful warship in the Mediterranean, was, in fact, sinking at its mooring. The psychological hammer of the attack was, for the sailors, even more devastating than the physical damage. This was not a battle. It was an execution. It was an assassination in their own home. There was no enemy fleet to fight, no noble gunnery duel at 30,000 yards. There was only the buzzing of the hornets, the helplessness, and the dark water rising around them. The Italian reports are filled with a sense of profound humiliation and disbelief. Their fury was directed at the obsolete, fabric-covered aircraft that had done this. These were Stringbags, machines their own modern fighters would have swatted from the sky in daylight. Yet these antiques, in the hands of daring pilots, had torn their masterpiece of modern engineering apart. This sense of shock, of a fundamental law of nature being overturned, was the true wound of Taranto. It was a trauma that would haunt the Regia Marina for the rest of the war. The shock waves from Taranto, however, were not confined to the Mediterranean. The sounds of the Littorio's hull tearing apart, the reports of the Caio Duilio and Conte di Cavour sinking, the news of this impossible raid, all travelled with lightning speed through the world's naval attachés. As the Littorio's crews, standing in shoulder-deep water, fought to save their ship, observers from the other side of the world were already taking meticulous notes. This perfect, devastating proof of concept that a carrier-launched torpedo strike on a fleet in a shallow harbour was possible was being studied with intense but professional interest by another ambitious naval power, one that had its own fleet of carriers and its own shallow harbour target in mind. The Japanese naval delegation in Europe had just been given their blueprint. The news of Taranto did not just shock Rome, it exploded across the naval ministries of the world. In the embassies of Rome and Berlin, naval attachés from every major power, America, Germany, and most notably, the Empire of Japan, were given a frantic, single-minded directive: find out what happened. And more importantly, find out times how asterisk. The sinking of 3 battleships at anchor, in a defended harbour, was not just a tactical event, it was a doctrinal crisis. It challenged the very foundation of naval power, which for 30 years had been built on the supremacy of the dreadnought. The impossible had occurred, and the Japanese, in particular, were desperate to acquire the blueprint. The Japanese naval delegation in Italy, led by an astute attaché, moved with incredible speed. Within days, their representatives were in Taranto, officially to offer condolences to their Axis partner, but in reality to conduct a meticulous forensic analysis of the attack. They walked the docks of the Mar Grande, observing the crippled Littorio and Caio Duilio resting on the bottom, their decks awash. They saw the half-submerged wreck of the Conte di Cavour. They took photographs. They spoke with stunned Italian officers. And they compiled a detailed, precise, and electrifying report, which was cabled immediately to the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The report highlighted 2 astonishing, game-changing facts. First, the devastating effectiveness of a carrier-launched, torpedo-based night attack, an operation of extreme complexity that the British had executed flawlessly. Second, and by far the most important, the report detailed that the British had somehow, in secret, solved the shallow water torpedo problem. The Japanese, whose own torpedoes required 75 to 100 feet of water, were stunned. The British had done it in 40 feet. In Tokyo, these dispatches were read with a quasi-religious fervour. They landed on the desks of 2 men who were already contemplating one of the most audacious operations in history: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and Commander Minoru Genda, his brilliant young air operations planner. Yamamoto, unlike many of his peers, was an aviation zealot. He did not believe the battleship was the future. He was already wargaming a plan for a decisive battle against the United States, one that would begin with a crippling, preemptive strike against their fleet. Genda, his protégé, was the man tasked with figuring out how to do it. Post-war testimony from Gender reveals that the Taranto report was not just interesting, it was a revelation. It was the final, missing piece of their puzzle. Gender and Yamamoto were not just students of the Taranto raid, they became its most devoted disciples. The problem for Yamamoto and Gender was identical to the one Lumley Lister had faced. Their primary target, the US Pacific Fleet, was not at sea. It was anchored in the shallow, placid waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The average depth of Pearl Harbor was, like Taranto, approximately 40 to 45 feet. Gender's initial plans had all concluded that a torpedo strike, the only weapon that could truly sink a battleship, was impossible. His strike would have to be a high-altitude bombing run, which was notoriously inaccurate and unlikely to achieve the decisive, crippling blow Yamamoto demanded. Taranto changed everything. The British Stringbags had provided the perfect, devastating proof of concept. It was times possible. Gender, according to his own accounts, immediately began a fanatical study of the raid. He and his team analysed every available piece of data, the use of flares for illumination, the two-wave attack structure, the bombing of airfields and oil depots as a diversion. But most of all, they focused on the torpedo. The Japanese did not know about the crude, wire and drum modification, but they now knew it was solvable. Japanese naval engineers were immediately tasked with a single, high-priority project: create a torpedo that could run true in 40 feet of water. Their solution would be more elegant than the British one they adapted: wooden fins to the tail of their Type 91 torpedoes to give them an aerodynamic, shallow entry profile, but the inspiration, the knowledge that it could be done, was a direct gift from Taranto. The lesson had been learned. The Japanese were, in this instance, the most diligent students in the world. The 21 Swordfish crews, in their desperate, brilliant 90-minute raid to win the Battle of the Mediterranean, just handed their future allies' greatest enemy the key to their own impossible attack. The British, in solving their own strategic stalemate, had unwittingly provided the blueprint for a day that would live in infamy. The global echo of Taranto was not just a ripple, it was a tsunami, and it was now, in late 1940, building speed as it raced across the Pacific, aimed squarely at a sleeping American harbor. This is the bookend, the final, global payoff that connects back to the thesis established on the pitching deck of Time's illustrious asterisk. The question posed in Part 1 was whether a handful of obsolete aircraft, launched from a steel deck in the dark, could neutralize the centuries-old doctrine of battleship supremacy. The Battle of Taranto answered that question with a resounding, regional yes. It proved the concept, crippled a fleet, and changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. But it was the event that followed, just 13 months later, that provided the final, undeniable, and global exclamation point. Taranto was the dress rehearsal. Pearl Harbor was the opening night of a new global war, and the script was a direct copy of the one written by Lumley Lister and his 21 Swordfish crews. The 13 months between November 1940 and December 1941 were, for the Japanese Imperial Navy, a period of intense, focused, and secretive development. Admiral Yamamoto, armed with the revelation from his naval attaché in Rome, now knew that his audacious plan to strike the US Pacific Fleet at anchor was not just a theoretical possibility. It had a proven, successful case study. As post-war testimony from Minoru Gender and other Japanese planners confirms, the IJN's aviation experts began a fanatical, reverse engineering of the Taranto raid. Their primary obsession was the torpedo. They did not know the specifics of the British wire and drum modification, but they knew the problem was solvable. Japanese engineers were tasked with the single, top-priority challenge: create a torpedo that could run in 40 feet of water. They tested countless ideas, and finally settled on a more elegant, but conceptually identical, solution. Attaching small wooden fins to the tails of their Type 91 torpedoes. These fins acted as stabilizers, much like the fletching on an arrow, preventing the torpedo's natural plunge and forcing it into a shallow, horizontal run. They practiced relentlessly, launching torpedoes in the shallow waters of Kagoshima Bay, which bore a striking resemblance to Pearl Harbor. The tactical comparison between the two raids is not just similar, it is a direct, point-by-point copy, an act of operational plagiarism. Taranto was the blueprint, and Pearl Harbor was the scaled-up mass production model. Let us examine the parallels. The target, in both cases, was a nation's entire battleship fleet, condensed and vulnerable, anchored in a shallow water harbor that High Command believed was torpedo-proof. The weapon, in both cases, was a specialized, secretly modified shallow water torpedo, the only weapon capable of killing a capital ship. The method in both cases was a carrier-launched multi-wave air attack. The Japanese, like the British, used a mix of aircraft, high-altitude bombers and dive bombers, the VALs, to strike airfields and oil depots to create a diversion and sow chaos, just as Scarlett's force had done at the Mar Piccolo. But the true, decisive, battleship-killing weapon was the torpedo bomber, the Cates, just as the 6 torpedo-carrying Swordfish had been the decisive element at Taranto. The result, in both cases, was the catastrophic crippling of a nation's battleship fleet in a matter of hours, achieving a strategic shock from which the US Navy, like the Italian Navy, would never fully recover its battleship-centric doctrine. This is the final, global payoff. The 6 British Swordfish of the first wave, led by Kenneth Williamson, did far more than cripple the Italian fleet. They did more than just secure the Malta convoys or win the Battle of the Mediterranean. With their 11 torpedoes, they fired the starting gun on a new age of warfare. They provided the precise, proven, and operational blueprint for the attack that would, just 13 months later, shatter the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, drag a sleeping giant into the global conflict, and fundamentally change the course of the 20th century. The Stringbag, the obsolete biplane of wire and fabric, was the teacher. The Japanese Kate was the student that perfected the lesson. And that lesson, which would ultimately lead to the age of the carrier and the end of the battleship, began on a cold November night, in the dark, smoke-filled skies above the Mar ground.